Welcome, everybody. It's nice to see so many folks back. How many people, do we have anybody here that was not here last week? Okay, good, welcome. I'm going to give a brief recap, and then we're going to do some meditation to start, and then I'm going to give a little bit of a presentation about how we might begin to pick our experience apart a little bit, deconstruct what is often experienced as a kind of jumble. One of the expressions that's been used is a traffic jam of discursive thinking that most of us inhabit for most of our lives. So we'll be talking about that a little bit, and then we'll be working with our journals. Did everybody bring the journal that we gave you last week back with you? Anybody that didn't? Okay, so for those of you that are just here for the first time tonight, when we get around to the journals, we will be happy to give you a journal and a pen. For those of you that we gave a journal to last week and you forgot it, we will give you a journal to borrow to use as a platform and a piece of paper that you can write on and take it home and transfer it into your journal. So, okay, I think that's the logistics. So now I'd like to ask, and who's passing the mic? Yeah, sure. That's great, Reeve, or Greg or Candlin would be happy to pass it. Yeah, why don't you give it to Candlin, she'll pass it. So I'm hoping somebody will be willing to accept this mic. I'm interested in whether or not, and I'm really interested in whether or not, whether you did or not, how many people actually were able to take 10 minutes each day and do some mindfulness practice? Good, it looks like a lot of folks. And how many people actually jotted down something in your journal about that? Good, excellent. Would anybody care to share anything about your experience of doing that this past week? Yeah, Reeve.
Okay, well.
Wait a minute, here comes the mic.
Oh, that's right.
You gave it away.
Oh, I know, it's terrible. I found it very restful. I found it a little jumbled, as you said. When I was able to come back to the breath, that I think was the restful part. There was a wonderful continuity in coming back to breathing. And I also, my written down thoughts were not lengthy afterwards, but that became a kind of pleasure just to jot down thoughts. I noticed I'd lost all my grammar, full sentences, how you create a paragraph. It was like little dots of impressions that I wrote down.
Okay.
And that's about it.
Thank you, Reeve. Anybody else care to share anything? Come on in.
I wish I were with Reeve. Mine wasn't that good. Yeah. And it's not like I'm new to this. I've done this before. However, I'm more successful with a guided meditation than being left to my own. I did wander a lot. And I found a couple of times a lot of, for lack of better word, crap surfacing. And found all of a sudden there were tears. And I went, oh, shit. This is supposed to be restful. So it was a little difficult. And then the writing was really helpful because I could put it someplace and then close the book. And then it was out of me and in someplace. It was in a file, essentially. A second piece that was a little more hopeful is that when my mind drifted, I did have some amazingly creative ideas that popped into my head. I was like, oh, that was a good one. I'll hang on to that. So I knew I wasn't supposed to drift, but it wasn't all that successful.
Well, I would like to differ with you there. I think it was very successful. I really think it's important to understand, and it takes a long time. It doesn't seem to matter how many times I say to people, there is no right or wrong way to do this. There is no good or bad meditation. What we're doing is some kind of investigation. And so with an investigation, if you start with an idea about how it should be, you're not going to be able to fully see what's going on, because you're going to be trying to see whether it meets that idea or not. So you're always influencing your experience with your preconceptions. So I would say that two things came to mind as you were speaking. One, for lack of a better word, crap. The man that I learned meditation from said that the ground of wakefulness is fertilized by the manure of experience. And so I think a lot of times our busy, busy minds, that traffic jam of discursive thoughts, that process is in the service of avoiding the crap and avoiding the things that would make us cry. So that was the other thing you said. Tears are a wonderful, wonderful sign that you're actually dipping beneath the surface of how we keep ourselves preoccupied and distracted so that we don't have to feel the depth of our human experience. And human experience is so rich. There are so many different aspects to it. And we, of course, like the aspects that make us feel good and don't like the aspects that don't make us feel good, or that make us feel bad, or that make us feel sad or angry or frightened or whatever. One of the greatest benefits that mindfulness practice can bring into our lives is the ability to be present and willing to experience the full range of human experience. Because we can't avoid it. We really can't avoid it. You might be able to avoid it right now, but somewhere down the line, you will face the full range of human experience, including your own death. We all will. So the ability to actually work with our minds and be able to stay present when things that are uncomfortable arise in our experience is what we're training when we train in mindfulness. And so I would say that you actually had a very good and productive meditation experience this week, because things came up and you noticed them. And that's really the point. The point is not, it's nice to be peaceful. It's wonderful when that happens. We all love it when, we sit down and I had an experience today, which I don't have very often, I'll tell you, but I had an experience today where for a few minutes, it was as if my breath was like the waves on the ocean. And I was just kind of floating along on that. It was so unusual for me that I really noticed it. But we do have a bias toward what makes us feel good and comfortable and peaceful. However, if we are going to be fully awake human beings, we need to be willing to recognize that bias and overcome it to the extent that we're able to stay present with things that aren't comfortable for us. So thank you for sharing that. Anybody else? Mary Liz?
I was,
Wait for the mic, please.
I was feeling like I made a new friend. You talked about, well, not new, she's been around for the last 82 years. I haven't always acknowledged that. Because you said something I heard before, but sometimes I need to hear things a number of times before I hear them. And that was it, about making friends with yourself, meditation. And so we had quite a conversation all this week. It's kind of an interesting guy. I think I'll stick around.
Thank you. I agree. She is kind of an interesting gal. Somebody, yeah, great, thank you.
Well, I liked it, and I've tried meditation many times. I've tried the guided meditation, and I hate them because I don't want someone else telling me how to do anything. I want to do it my way. And it was such a wonderful feeling to know there is no right or wrong way. I would drift off, and I'd listen to the fire crackling and the water pouring somewhere and the rain, and then come back to my breath, and it was all okay. And Barry and I do it together every night for 10 minutes. And I was thinking, well, we should do it 10 minutes at night now, not just in the morning. And then I realized, that's my old way. Always more. And then I end up failing. And I'm not going to fail on this because there's no reason. I don't have to push.
Yeah.
And I really like it. And I've only written one thing in my journal, and that's what it was. It was that, wow, there's no wrong way to do this. I can just do it.
Good, that's great. Anybody else? Yes.
I had difficulty with keeping my eyes open, and because I had done meditation in the past, and I've always had closed eyes, and I felt that I was just, instead of my breath, trying to, I know you said to just have a gaze and not really focus on anything, but my eyes kept wanting to close. And so I thought I would hear you say, well, do what is comfortable for you. But I thought there must be a reason to try to do it with open eyes. And so I just struggled with that.
Right.
And continued for
Well, I would say
20 minutes and wasn't sure, to get my focus away from that to the breath.
I would say don't do anything that becomes so all-consuming that it takes over your meditation. So if trying to keep your eyes open becomes something that is so much of a struggle for you that that's what you're doing, then, relax and let your eyes close if that's what you feel like doing. But I would say alternate and play with it and see. The reason we do it with our eyes open, well, there are a number of reasons, but one of them, the one that I find most compelling, is that we live our lives with our eyes open. We go around in the world with our eyes open. And one of the things that is really problematic in a lot of I don't want to say that. One of the things that creates obstacles for us is when our meditation becomes something that is very separate from our lives. And what we are really working with here is developing something, and I'm going to talk a little bit at the end of tonight's session about meditation in action. But what we're really talking about here is developing a quality of wakeful presence that we talked about last week that we can tap into and relax into and have confidence in no matter where we are. So a lot of times when people close their eyes and do a mantra or do some kind of thing when they meditate, then they feel like, well, now I'm all upset at work or wherever I am. I need to, when I get home and meditate, I'll be able to process this. By being willing to actually dissolve the boundary between meditation and non-meditation, we begin to have confidence that in any moment we can tap into that state where we're just present and we can see what's arising within us and we can see what's occurring around us. And since we live most of our lives with our eyes open, it's helpful to practice it in that way. But if that becomes a big obstacle in your path, then close your eyes and see what that's like.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Good. Okay, thank you. I really appreciate people's willingness to share. And I want to share something that my husband said sitting at the lunch table today. He asked me last week, he said, after we got home, he said, can I get one of those journals? I want to do what you suggested doing. So he said today, it's an interesting thing to write about what your experience has been in practicing. And so I want to encourage those of you who didn't write that this is another way of kind of exploring, having a little bit of accountability, because if you make it a practice to at least, if you do nothing else, write down, I sat for 15 minutes. You will actually have, for yourself, nobody else is going to check up on this, you will have some accountability with yourself about whether you're maintaining any kind of discipline or not. The other thing is, if you jot down a few words, mind scattered, full of crap, cried, if you write down a few of those things, you'll begin to be able to see patterns. And I'm going to talk about patterns tonight, but first, I think we've given enough time that we could start with a little bit of sitting. So I'd like to invite you, again, for those of you who were not here last week, I'm going to give a recap, and for those of you that like guided meditation, I'll give a little recap. So these are the 4 points. We're going to take your seat, comfortable, upright, relaxed. For me, if I'm sitting back like this, it's hard for me to actually feel like I'm practicing. So I invite you, if it's comfortable for you and you don't have back or hip problems or something, to sit forward and feet on the floor, hands relaxed on your knees or thighs, wherever they comfortably fall. Eyes open, gazing down at the floor in front of you, or whatever is soft gaze, whatever is in your visual field. Object, choose a focus for your attention. In this case, we are working with the breath, which is always available to us and difficult to make too big a deal out of. So the breath, it could be the breath going out the end of your nose, it could be the breath in your abdomen as it rises and falls. Wherever you feel the breath most, maintain an open curiosity about what you notice. We don't need to judge what occurs, what arises. This is purely, if you think of yourself as a scientist, actually methodically exploring your inner state. It doesn't matter what arises. We're not trying to create a particular state. We're trying to find out what's there. What is my state of mind right now? And whenever you notice that your attention has wandered, whenever you notice that you are not with the breath, you know you've been thinking, because that's what happens. Thinking is what takes us away. And you can think about something that's in the environment here. You can think about something that happened yesterday or will happen tomorrow. We'll talk about a little bit more about what thinking does in terms of the filter that it overlays onto our direct experience. But whenever you notice that your attention has wandered, just simply, gently come back. You know, the breath will be coming back around again, so come back to the breath. So let's do that for a few minutes. Any questions? Anybody have any questions? All right, let's do that for a few minutes. If you find your mind wandering really far afield, come all the way back, not just to your breath, but come back to a sense of being in your body. Feel what it feels like to be sitting here on the chair in this room. And then when you feel stabilized here, bring your attention to your breath and resume the practice. Did everybody get the handout that I sent with the things from last week? If anybody who didn't get it, come up to me and give me your email address or let me know and I'll print it off. Okay, so we talked about applying mindfulness and how we learn to direct our attention and detect patterns, and then we can deliver benefit. So I want to talk a little bit about detecting our patterns tonight. This is a way of deconstructing them, because actually that jumble that we experience is a combination of our bodily sensations, our emotions, and our thought process, all bound up, tied up together, tangled up together, you could say, because that's how it is. And so what that causes is reactivity. We are conditioned, all of us are conditioned beings. In order to interrupt the momentum of our conditioning, we have to be able to create some space. We have to be able to engineer a gap, shall we say. We don't actually engineer it. The gap is always there, but we don't notice it when we are full speed ahead. Does that make sense? So, part of the way we create the space is by noticing that there is actually a difference between our bodily sensations, our emotions, and our thoughts. That's why this triangle is not connected. They're gaps, because there actually are gaps that we can experience once we begin to be able to direct our attention and notice what's going on with us. So, let's just say we have an event. That happens over and over again, every day. We have some event, and then we have our appraisal of the event. It may call for action, it may be worthy of being ignored, and then we either do something or don't do something about it. So in order to, if we would like to be able to deliver benefit into this world. So you remember we talked last week about the benefits that arise personally from mindfulness that we can actually experience within ourselves. There are also societal benefits from people being mindful. And it has to do with interrupting reactivity. So I want to talk about the introspection that we could have when something happens that we immediately have a reaction to. So I'd like to invite you to think about something. It could be from your far distant past. It could have happened just a few minutes ago. Think about something where you found yourself having a really strong reaction. Could be a personal encounter, could be the news, whatever. Think about something where you had a very strong reaction. And I want you to just stop a minute. I would like you to close your eyes at this point. Stop a minute and call that to mind as vividly as you can, whatever it was that you had the reaction to. Can you feel it somewhere in your body? When you call that to mind, do you feel anything in your body? Is there an emotional component to it? Are you aware of some emotion that is triggered by that? And finally, what is the story that you tell yourself about what happened? What are the thoughts around it? Okay, open your eyes. If we had more time, if we were coming back tomorrow, I would give you this as homework. I would say, over the next day, notice when you are triggered by something, and when that happens, see if you can feel it in your body. It's interesting because science tells us that things happen in our body before we're aware of them. Indeed, actually, the neurons that fire in our brain to cause our hand to push a button, this is something they've done psychological, neurological tests about, those neurons fire before the person is aware of making the decision. Think about that. That's a little scary, actually. Before the person, this person, that person, you, me, before we're even aware of deciding this free will that we think we have, deciding what we think we'll do, our body is already doing it. Our body is already initiating that. So the more that we can become aware of things as they arise in our bodies, the closer we're getting to actually experiencing the space around any event. Does that make sense to people? Yes, no, maybe. Anybody got a question? Yes,
I feel like I'm a person who doesn't...
Wait a minute. Kendlin's handing you a microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. I feel like I'm a person who doesn't somatize anything. I mean, I can run the scenario of my husband being dead on the side of the road, and I feel like I don't feel anything in my body. I don't get a headache. I don't have palpitations. Whereas my friends say they run the same scenario and they are short of breath or they feel nauseated.
Well,
So it's hard for me to connect.
yeah. What's your name?
Janice.
Janice. So that's very good information for you about yourself. I can speak from my own experience that for much of my life, I was not aware of anything going on in my body. I was not, all I knew was that I was clumsy. And I think I was clumsy because I wasn't aware of my body. But I didn't experience things, well, I experienced things like asthma. I had, which is very much tied into your state of mind, but I didn't experience it as being within my body. So that's some very valuable information for you. Each one of us is going to have a different experience of this, and it's really valuable to be willing to actually acknowledge, not to think there's some right way, I should be feeling this somewhere in my body. If you feel it in your body, you feel it in your body. If you don't feel it in your body, that's information too. Thank you. Anybody else have anything about this? So the bodily thing is it's very handy because it's tangible. If you can connect in your body, if you can feel something in your body, then that gives you something actually tangible here in this world to relate to with regard to, let's say somebody pulls out in front of you. This is a pretty, common example. Yeah, somebody pulls out in front of you when you're driving down the road and you have to slam on the brakes. I think probably most people have a physical experience at that point. Reeve?
It's a fear. For me, it's a fear right here. It's right under the ribs, and I have that with fear or anxiety anyway. And I've been told it's this, that, or the other, but what I know is I've got a stone under my ribs. Big one, sudden maybe. But that has to do with, and it can be emotional anxiety, or it can be put on the brakes because even a squirrel, for heaven's sake, something in front of the car. But you feel it. You feel it almost there before anywhere else.
Yes. I should have had you have the mic, but she's a stone right there. Fear, whether it's emotional or... So this is a valuable thing because sometimes if you don't feel something in your body, well, most of us, this is what we notice first, emotion. We notice the emotion, and we don't necessarily notice it in our body. We notice, let's say you got angry about something. Let's say somebody said something that made you mad. What we notice first is that arising of the anger. Then, generally, what most of us do is start telling ourselves a story about why we're angry, why we're right to be angry, why that person was wrong to do what they did, and on we go, right? Does this resonate with people's experience? Anybody doesn't get what I'm talking about? So generally, that's why I've drawn that nice little cloud there. We can stay caught right there in the storyline for a long, long time. We can carry it through our whole life. And people do. That's how we come to have baggage that we drag from one situation to another. We come trailing clouds of emotional residue that we've created storylines about, and we hang on to them. So we're talking about the possibility of interrupting that kind of momentum, that it's not necessary to live our lives that way. We can actually live our lives mindfully, with wakeful presence, from moment to moment, engaging openly with whatever arises. But in order to do that, we have to be able to interrupt the momentum of reactivity, because we are conditioned beings, and we do have our conditioned responses to things. So, the bodily sensations, I think it's important to realize that we use the word feelings in multiple senses. And feelings, we could say, what do you feel with your body? That's actually, or I feel sick, or I feel this microphone stand. We feel in that way. We also feel, I feel really happy that so many people came back tonight to hear what we have to say about how to work with your mind. Feelings are the way we express this spectrum here, from bodily sensations to our emotions. Emotions tend to fuel our thoughts. So when we're sad, we look for a reason why we're sad, you know, and because then we think we can maybe fix it, not have to be sad. Actually, the more attention you pay to life, the more you begin to realize that making friends with sadness is a very life-enhancing thing to do. Because human life is sad. It's not just sad, but it is sad. We will all die. Everybody we love will die. And there'll be heartache in between here and there. So how could that not be sad? So if we're trying to ward off sadness in our lives, then, we got a bigger job than Sisyphus. If we learn instead how to make friends with sadness and to recognize that our human hearts have evolved to incorporate the full range of human experience, then we can actually see how the emotions are fueling our thoughts, and we can interrupt them. But the easiest place, the first place that we can learn to interrupt is, okay, so those thoughts and storylines where we stay caught, those lead to actions, words or deeds, right? We sit, we think, and we rev ourselves up, and we think, I'm going to go give him a piece of my mind. So the first place where we can interrupt, where we have the potential to interrupt our momentum, is between our thoughts and our actions. Actions come back to the body. It takes the body to speak or do something. So if we begin to realize what reactivity feels like, and if we begin to recognize through our practice of mindfulness what a storyline feels like when it's going, we can actually create the space within which the insight will arise to let us know whether the reactivity, well, then it won't be reactivity. If we allow that space to arise, then we can choose the response that will be skillful and helpful in that moment, instead of just spewing forth whatever might happen to arise within us. We actually then have a choice. Space is an interesting, I really love talking about space in this space, because space is really in a way, you could say space and intelligence are synonymous, because when there is no space, there is very little possibility for intelligence to arise. There's very little possibility for appreciation to arise. There's very little possibility for discrimination to arise. Space allows insight. Museums, libraries. Next week we'll be working, we're going to explore the full space of this library, including the gallery next week, and how mindfulness can help us engage with and appreciate our world more fully. But one of the things that I find helpful, and this is a metaphor for the mind, but it helps to think about it as does everybody here somewhere in your house have either, or it could be in your garage, or your attic, or your basement, or your shed, a place that everything gets stuck, shoved, put, or it could be a drawer in your kitchen. Everything gets jumbled up. And then periodically, we get a bee in our bonnet and decide to clean things out. And we may discover when that happens, things we had completely forgotten about, things that we really appreciate, things we're glad we rediscovered. But as long as they were sort of jumbled up, we could not appreciate them. When we create space, we can appreciate things. So in this case, when we do mindfulness practice, we are creating the space to appreciate our minds. We are creating the space to appreciate our bodies. We are creating the space to appreciate our history, our passengers, our baggage, whatever it is that makes us us. That's what we mean by making friends with ourselves. Does that make sense? So that's what we're working with here. And the potential to interrupt the momentum, the first place we begin to experience that space is that we recognize a storyline for a storyline, and just as we're about to pick up the phone and call that person or whatever, we say, wait a minute, maybe I'll wait a little while and see if this still seems like a good idea. When you have been doing mindfulness practice for a more extended period of time, you will begin to be able to interrupt the momentum between the emotion and the thought. In other words, you will begin to recognize, oh, there's that emotion again. And then you realize how we grasp to find something to hook it onto. But the fact of the matter is, often, whatever it is we find to hook it onto has nothing to do with why the emotion arose. I'm sure people have had the experience of something bad happens to you. What do they talk about? Kicking the dog, or getting really angry at the drawer that won't open, but you're not really angry at the drawer. That experience that we have of overreacting to something because we're actually carrying stuff that we don't know anything about. And the only way we'll ever find out anything about it is by being willing to actually explore our own inner experience. And nobody can do that for us. If you have, really deep psychological wounds, emotional wounds, you can find a therapist who can help you. But ultimately, you have to do it yourself. You have to be willing to go in and do that work yourself. If you do, what you discover, what you will discover eventually is that trustworthy ground of wakeful presence that you can always come back to. And that can accommodate whatever arises, however potent it may be, however irritating, heartbreaking, thrilling, wonderful. The full range of human experience. Any questions about this?
So it seems like you're saying that
Let's Stick with the mic here.
That it's still, thoughts can send you astray with storylines, but in order to break the pattern here and interrupt the momentum, you have to think.
Well, that's a very interesting point. I would say,
what you described was a way of thinking about the emotions.
right. I would call it
Made the space.
I would call it, it's very much analogous to the experience that you have when you are practicing mindfulness and you're trying to stay with your breath and you get caught in your thoughts. You start thinking about something else. Then at a certain point, you realize, oh, I'm supposed to be meditating. That's what I'm trying to do. So that is a thought. But that moment before that, there's that moment where you suddenly realize. That moment is not actually a thought. It's actually wakeful presence popping through. And so I would say, yes, there are thoughts associated with, well, maybe I won't make that phone call, or whatever the interruption of the momentum might be. But the moment of wakeful presence breaking through the momentum of our habitual patterns is actually not a thought. It's just our basic nature popping through. Does that make any sense?
I think of it as, because I really have trouble meditating. I have a lot of mind parasites that get in the way. And I always think of it as the thought that, okay, where am I? And then I think, okay, well, how do I get back on track? Focus on breathing. It's all thinking that is part of the realization and part of the interrupting the momentum and going in the wrong direction.
No, that sounds very healthy. It sounds very, like a very sane approach to it. I think my own experience for a long, long time was I never experienced anything that wasn't a thought. I mean, that run-on, just traffic jam of discursive thoughts. Even if I wasn't aware of that moment before, I would just suddenly I'd go from the thought of my breakfast or the thought of the person that I was going to call when I got up to the thought, oh my God, I'm supposed to be meditating and I've completely forgotten my breath. Those thoughts were so close together I didn't notice there was any possibility of anything in between them. But what I eventually discovered is that there is that moment when you realize that you've forgotten to meditate, you're already back. You're already back. You don't have to do anything else to come back. The moment that you realize you're already back, and then you have the thoughts, oh, I'm supposed to be meditating, I should go back to my breath, etc. So just play with that and see whether you have that experience or not. What's your name? Mike. Thank you, Mike. Yes.
Hello. I was thinking about it. I've been working on this for a little while, and I still haven't gotten it. I usually have the emotions, have the thoughts, react, and then I say, oh no, I forgot. I'm supposed to take a breath.
Yeah.
So what are the tricks for telling yourself this is the story? Do you know what I mean? Like, how do I get closer?
Good question. What's your name?
Val.
Good question. I think it's a matter of familiarity. I think the more that you do it, the more you become familiar with your particular habitual patterns. The ones that are hardest to recognize are the ones that are most deeply embedded, that we don't even recognize that they are habitual patterns. We don't recognize that they are storylines. To us, they are the way reality is. So the more that you interrupt that simply by coming back to the breath, which has no qualitative value, shall we say, as opposed to good thoughts and bad thoughts. The breath is just the breath. The more you come back, practice coming back to that, the more you begin to realize the difference, the contrast becomes greater, so that what it feels like to be caught up as opposed to be experiencing some space.
So when you're in an altercation with somebody, so when you're in that moment, you're in the altercation, like, because I'm talking about not so much somebody driving by you and they're already gone, but, dealing with your kids or your friend or your husband, your father, and they just keep repeating things, and you're taking it in and you're telling yourself this story. So in that moment, I should be concentrating on my breath?
No, absolutely not. And thank you. We will, in the fourth class, we will, there's so much to present here that I'm really trying to figure out how to get it into 4 classes. But in the fourth class, we will talk about communication and mindful communication. But just to give you a little preview there, in terms of this, the way you work with that, when you're hearing that person say the same thing they've said over and over again, and you usually react in exactly the same way to it, you can back it up. You can back it up, and instead of coming out with the words that you normally come out with, and which come from the thoughts that you normally have, you can back it up. And sometimes you can touch the emotion, but usually the emotion is kind of charged at that point. Come back to the bodily sensation. Just as you're listening to that, see, where do I feel this in my body? When he says that, my stomach clenches up, or when he says that, I start getting shaky, or whatever it might be. Come back to your bodily sensations, because that's a way of grounding yourself in the moment.
Thank you.
I work in human services, and a way that we work with people de-escalating is like pushing their feet into the floor. So at some point when you're really angry, you start to dissociate, not see things that are in the room. So just calling something on me like, oh, that book over there is blue, and just doing, not verbally, but just saying in your mind, like, that's blue, that's red. Pushing your feet in the floor, pushing your fingers together, that'll really ground you and bring you back. So it seems to work for me and my clients. So.
Good, thank you. Yeah, I think that quality of mindfulness, I mean, that's what we're cultivating, in that quality of mindfulness, whether it's where am I feeling this in my body, or, well, there's a lot of space here, That's helpful. There's a lot of space here, or the book is blue, or I feel my feet on the floor. I can do that. So what we want to do is interrupt the habitual train going down the track, shall we say. Does that make sense? Good. Anything else? Anybody else? Because I want to turn this over to Reeve, and we're going to work with doing some writing right here in this space here tonight, to explore how mindfulness can be connected to our pen and paper and finger. One more, okay.
Hi, just one quick thought. Just realizing in this conversation, like, how are we going to apply this to everything in all these moments? Deconstructing the pattern, right? So we all have our own personal patterns, and the more we practice, the more we'll notice these patterns. I'm hopeful of that. And then we can notice, okay, when there's a commercial that has a child screaming in it, it tends to give me a bodily sensation of X. So I can recognize that earlier, to sort of understand my own patterns, and then hopefully guard myself, or not guard, but be able to find that wakeful presence easier, because we're understanding our own patterns. So
yes.
I think it's easy for me to think about, how, like, it's a challenge to think about how we're going to apply it to all the situations, but just trying to focus on the patterns, I think is helpful for me to at least frame this practice and the goal of this course.
Yes. So again, I'll keep coming back to these 3 things. If we learn how to direct our attention, then we can detect the patterns, and then we can deliver benefit. If we don't know what the patterns are, we're just going to be spewing out our conditioning, whatever it is. So directing our attention allows us to detect the patterns, and this is one way of looking at the patterns that we have that are comprised of our bodily sensations, our emotions, and our thought process.
What was
Good.
the last one again? The last thing that was the brain.
Thought process, bodily sensations, emotions, and thought process.
No.
Oh, deliver benefit.
Deliver benefit.
Yeah, deliver benefit. Yeah, to deliver benefit, you have to be able to discern benefit. And seeing the patterns we have within us allows us to see more clearly the patterns around us, and therefore we're more likely to be able to discern what will be of benefit. You know, sometimes, like to use your example about when you're in a pattern with a family member that is repetitive, sometimes we might actually get to the point where we discern that the very most useful thing right now is to postpone this conversation until things have cooled it down, so we don't keep doing the same thing. So yeah, that allows us to discern and then deliver benefit. Good. Yes.
So when my daughter was a teenager, we had battles, which you have, and we got to the point where we discussed it. We didn't like fighting. Neither one of us were both kind of conflict avoidant, but we came to the point where we talked about it, and we did exactly what you said. When we found ourselves kind of heading down that rabbit hole, one of us, and I'm happy to say half the time it was Atlee, who was 17, would say, whoa, let's take a step back, take some breaths, and then come back and discuss it. So it does work as long as the person on the other side is willing to have that same conversation with you. But we found it extremely helpful to our relationship and getting through those teenage years together.
Thank you. Okay, so can I turn this over to you?
Yes.
I think I'll just sit here.
You may sit right there. Oh, wait a minute. There, I hope. Carol asked me to come as a writer. She's also a writer. But she asked me to come and maybe do a little bit with writing. That's why we have the notebooks, as well as for your own meditation practice. And what I'd like to do is just 3 little exercises.
You know what, Reeve, I realize we need to hand out the notebooks and paper to people.
We need notebooks.
So, yeah, so if,
Just write it in like this.
how many people got a notebook last week and left it home? Okay, we want to give you pieces of paper and a notebook.
You would,
Let me have a couple of those.
people who need paper.
Yeah, yeah, and here's something so you need a pen? Okay.
I'm going to get a drink of water, and if anybody else would like to, there is some. There's water back there.
And the people who were here, who were not here last week did not get a notebook. Have you gotten one now? Okay, we've got, Greg, can you give these folks that just came for the first time notebook?
You can bring your own notebook, right? Yeah.
Yeah, you can bring if you've got your own notebook, that's great. We just wanted people to have one, so. Okay, has everybody got a pen and a piece of paper or a notebook? You don't have a pen. Greg, do you have some more pens?
As I said earlier, when we were talking about the meditations, our 10-minute meditations, or whatever they were, I said to Carol that I found it was a jumble, as she had expressed, the jumble of the traffic jam when I was sitting. I found I was involved in what I was seeing and what I was hearing and what I was feeling. And those things kind of came back and forth without much separation. It's not necessary for them to be separated, but I think it's interesting as observers and as writers to exercise how much, what do we see? If you're sitting and looking, not meditating, what do you see? If you're right here, right now, and you see. So I think I'll give us 3 to 5 minutes. And if you have your pen and your notebook or your paper, write down what you see. The wonderful things that what you see reminds you of, and the stories and the places that it takes you, those are for another time. It's very useful in the writing. But right now, it's just what you see. Close to, far away, a high, low, here, there. Just what you see. About 3 minutes. Oh, I think we could stop. Or kind of finish up. It's quite a bit to see. I don't know whether you found that you could see a lot, or whether you had to stop quickly, or how that was. Anybody wish to share? Anything at all? I myself did just a kind of a list. Did carpet patterns, tangled wires, bright round lights. Oh, good read. Many, many legs. Tables, chairs, people's legs. Arches as decorative elements in windows. Podium, steps, ceiling, shapes of radiators. Wheels, step stools, shoes, so many shoes. Signs, signage. Now that's me thinking, right? Do you call them signs or do you say signage? Books. It took me, 7 or 8 lines before I thought I saw books. And on and on and on and on. So it was almost too much to see. But did you find yourself distracted by things that you were hearing or feeling? A little bit or not? I don't know.
Very quiet.
Very quiet. It's very, very quiet. Yeah. So,
You've got somebody over.
oh, I have somebody. Oh, good.
So I'm not sure if I did it wrong.
There's no right, there's no wrong. This is really, there's no right or wrong.
So I got really specific, or just
Good.
focused. A red jacket hanging from the back of a chair, occupied by a man my father's age. A lobster peeks out at me on his blue shirt. The date is 1640. Is printed there. Could this be how old the shirt is? Doubtful.
That's very nice. And there she goes. Well, I love that.
So I should have just kept it.
No, don't be ridiculous. That's what you saw. That's what you thought. And what's useful, I wrote more than one book where I start with one thing that I'm seeing, or an image even. I started with a door. Started the door in the house where I grew up. And from that door came the whole book. But that was the door was what I was absolutely really seeing. Not literally at the time I was writing, but I knew that so well because I could see it. And I was not, I wasn't too interrupted by what I thought about it, if the word interrupted is right in that context, the context of memoir, but it was that real door that took me into a book. That was very important to me. Yep. Yes.
I wrote also about the red jacket.
That's a very important antique jacket.
I saw the jacket, I saw there was a B on it for Boston, and which took me right into, I lost my husband last year to Alzheimer's. And one of the things he always wanted to do was go to see a boxing game. So I got him to a boxing game, and he didn't remember it. So I ended up with, don't wait. Just don't wait.
Yeah.
You know, if you want to go see a boxing game, go. plainly know what to do with that.
Oh, that's lovely. This is about writing. I'm not a meditation teacher. So when I tell me what you see, the writer in you is going to come onto that page. But you have learning perception. You are learning your seeing from meditation practice, I believe. But the writer is in you. I'm sorry, was there another one?
I did mine in clusters, so I kind of, everything I could see up there was sort of in one cluster, and then these ladies who lucked out with the comfortable chairs and had their shoes on. This is like another cluster of words. Oh, I'm coming earlier next week. And then I was like, okay, the camera and things over in that cluster. So I kind of categorized mine by zone, and it took me a long time to get to books as well.
Yeah. Oh, I'm so glad. Thank you. Anybody else? Oh, good. Yes. Here comes the mic.
I basically lost in memories in this room when it used to be the children's room.
Yeah.
And what it meant to my kids, particularly to my daughter, who would run around to all the shelves and take down a pile of maybe 10 or 15 books, lay down on the floor with them. And Mrs. Cutting said that was fine. When we were ready to leave, I wanted to put the books back. And Mrs. Cutting would say, no, it's okay, Dawn can leave them there. And then one of my big mistakes was going into a bookstore in Burlington. And upstairs was the room where the adult books were, and the children's room was downstairs. So every once in a while, I would go down to check what was going on. And there's my daughter laying on the floor with this huge pile of books. And I'm trying to explain to her, you can't do that here, honey. These are brand new books. Well, Mrs. Cutting lets me do it. And, catching a bat up here one night. Or
Catching a bat?
Yeah.
Right. I heard about that. I was not here with
Just
that.
asked her to give me, because she wasn't Mrs. Cutting, was the other lady whose name I can't think of right now. She didn't want to touch it, before, and she was afraid the children would get hurt. So I said, just give me a waste basket and a piece of cardboard. And I
Oh, this is excellent.
scooped them up.
I love it.
Got the basket, took him outside, and stood on the steps, and he, swung the basket to give him momentum to fly. It was springtime, and he was just coming out of hibernation, I guess.
Poor thing.
And the poor thing went zigzagging across the street like a drunken sailor, smashed into a car. And one part he wanted to go visit if he's okay, and the other part was, if he isn't, then how do I explain this to my daughter that I just killed a bat?
Well, that little story, you could come right over to, we have a group that meets once a month at the St. J House, and it was kind of a memoir group, but it's really just a writing group. But we don't, we have years ago, we started with some kind of prompt, like what are you seeing, what are you thinking about it, or what's a meal, what are meals like in your life, and so forth. But it is extraordinary how, through the work that Carol does, I think you can kind of watch your mind focus in on something, and then you can fly off here and there with the bat, if you wish. I think that the jacket might have somebody over here had something they wanted to say. I believe. Is that you?
Did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, you've got the jacket too.
The red jacket speaks.
Jacket has a voice.
I wrote that the Athenaeum is such a beautiful building. I love the architecture, including the medallions on the ceiling holding the light pictures. I often come here just to sit in one of those big old comfy leather chairs, just to read and view the artwork and gaze at the woodwork. And I added the spiral staircases, which are downstairs.
Yeah, those are wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, I've got another quick one. It's Patty. Gotcha.
This reminds me of a poem called The Red Wheelbarrow.
Oh!
By William Carlos
what you're talking about?
So much.
It's a quick perception.
Quick perception, the red wheelbarrow in the rain, was it?
So much depends.
Red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens.
Oh, thank you. All right. Okay. Okay, I've got another quick one. This is harder. I found this very hard. I was trying to figure, because, well, sometimes I can hear and sometimes I can't hear, but I'm going to try I hear. And that'll be in just 3 minutes. See what you hear. Well, I didn't hear much. So I've got a scratch of pen on paper, a hum or whir of a fan, someone turning a page, shifting legs to change position, a very tiny high noise like a cricket, unless that's in my own ear, rumble of truck on the street, click of a ballpoint pen, someone writing fast behind me. I could hear that it was fast. Clearing of the throat, thank you, whoever did that. Rustle of paper, my own legs uncrossing, and a sniff. That was it. Takes me a while to hear things. Mary Elizabeth.
I'll tell you something you already know. I didn't follow the rules.
No,
but this is what came.
good.
I hear a hell of a lot less than I used to. It's what I don't hear anymore that bothers me. I miss the warblers in spring. They don't sing in the range I can hear anymore. I almost can hear the voice of my child, my firstborn, learning to babble, gurgle, and laugh. I hear my own voice. I haven't lost that yet, warning me of danger ahead, on a dark night, on a curving road. A soft voice in the darkness. Something is in the road. Sure enough, I go around the curve, and there is the biggest moose I've ever seen in my life.
Whoa. All right.
Told you I didn't follow.
I just pretend there were rules, Mary Liz.
I like your style.
I told you we were just here to have fun this time. But as you either do or don't feel you can write about things you can hear, and I was really trying hard to hear something, and then of course I didn't. But whatever that process of focus is, that I think will increasingly come from meditation practice, mindfulness practice. It takes you where you want to go, I think, more often than you may understand. Certainly it does in writing. But, okay, last one. Oh, anybody else? I'm sorry. Anybody else? See, nobody else heard anything either.
I knew the gentleman was writing with a pencil behind you without looking.
Oh, good for you.
She heard a pencil.
She heard a pencil. Good for you.
I guess my perception is very different because rather than specifics or particular items, with respect to the first exercise, for me, I was seeing contrast, light, shadows, and then I saw organization and where there wasn't organization. And I saw the organization patterns in books and chairs and rug. And anyway, but with respect to hearing, again, I didn't zero in on specific sounds. Instead, it was more of a very generalized, I said, I hear experience and wisdom, perceptive, probing thoughts, occasionally my stomach, a faint ringing in the back of my head, and I'm sure that's what you heard. Shifting, stirring, pauses for reflection. I hear quiet, calm. I hear lots of curiosity and intellect in the voices, memories of parents and children. I hear life in the room from many backgrounds. So I just came at it from, I guess, a place that I wasn't expecting to.
It's amazing how many unexpected places there are when you you are quiet and thinking and writing and meditating. Oh, jump.
I said I hear silence, and I said, which is not a usual thing to me because I tend to fill my life with noise. I said it can be the birds chattering outside, or it could be the washing machine churning inside. Perhaps I fear that when there is silence, something is missing. I probably have a lot to learn.
Nice, though. Oh, nice. Yeah. Silence isn't empty, really. Even when there's silence, it's not an emptiness. It's kind of a, for me anyway, it's a very positive, full quality. Carol, do we have time for one more?
Absolutely.
I know you have things that you'd like to do.
No, absolutely. Let's do it.
Well, this last one is feel. I feel. And you can really do what you want. I'm thinking about, I feel sitting here in the chair, and I must say, in my meditations, I wrote a lot about my sitting bones, which, you know. But whatever it is that you feel, and you can go wherever you need to go with that. 3 minutes. I think that's good. Anybody feel anything? Feel is hard. Oh, good. All right.
I won't read you exactly what I wrote, but the first half was how comfortable I feel here. One, I work in this room once a week, so I'm very comfortable in this space. And then all of you have been so open and so thoughtful that I feel very comfortable in this group. And then conversely, I was thinking, as Reeve said, how physically uncomfortable I am. My butt hurts in this seat. So it's just an interesting dichotomy of the two sets of feelings.
You've got an essay in contrast here. Nicely done. Anybody else? Well, I started with just playing what I felt, and then kind of went into that same sense of community or something. I feel fingers on pen, crossed legs, back against chair, among many chairs. Community and commonality of a good group gathering together, generous, thoughtful minds, nice faces. I feel the friendliness of this room and the people here for mindfulness training, effort, and intention without urgency. More and more, and what I meant by that was I needed to, there's more. there's more than that I feel here. But that's a hard one to start with. And it goes into Carol's territory that she can work with better than I can from the point of view of what I call just writing, although it's never really just writing. It's part of everything else, too. So that's just a little bit of what I wanted to share.
Thank you so much, Reeve. And I think two things that arose in my mind as I was listening to you, Reeve, and to people here. If you recall, last week when I was talking about the personal benefits that arise from mindfulness practice, one of the words under that list was creativity. And I really feel that in this room, just the various ways that people, just something as simple as I see, I hear, I feel, and we all bring so much richness to that. So I'd like to invite you in your homework for the week of continuing your daily mindfulness practice, and I'd like to invite you to keep that notebook next to you, and if you can't think of anything else, I hear, or I see, or I feel, or I felt, or I saw, or whatever, as you were sitting, just touch just a little bit, as much as you want. But it's a very useful tool for tracking ourselves. So thank you very much. And we will do more with this, but this gives you at least a beginning for bringing the combination of mindfulness and creativity onto the page. So there's something actually tangible. Mindfulness is not just, I remember, and actually I think it's one of the objections that a lot of social activists have to meditation, is like, well, you're just sitting there doing nothing. But in fact, we're not doing nothing. In fact, we're actually exploring the human experience in a way that if we stay busy all the time trying to fix things, we don't get a chance to do. So I really encourage you to take advantage of the fact that we've embarked on this journey together, and we can support each other in doing that, and that can help you to establish a meditation practice, because it's not easy to establish it, and it helps to have some support. So I had one more thing that I wanted to introduce in terms of practice this week, which is a contemplation practice. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about meditation in action and how we might use that as part of our homework. But the contemplation practice is useful in so many different ways. It's useful when something's bothering us and we can't figure out what it is. It's useful when we have a situation that we're not sure what to do about. It's useful when we want to clarify our goals. It's useful in almost any situation in which we would like to bring more clarity and insight into the process of making a decision or understanding an experience. So these are the 4 steps of contemplation practice. First, you clear a space with mindfulness. So if you want to do, I'm going to just give you an idea, and then we're going to do a very short contemplation here that will be our final meditation, and then we'll talk about homework. But the first thing is we'll sit for a couple of minutes. I'm going to guide you through this. Bring to mind a question or an issue. Be patient. So one of the things that is actually an obstacle to insight arising is our impatience to have an answer. And so be patient, open curiosity, and then set aside the first answer that comes up. It may be valid, it may be valuable, it may be something you need to take into consideration, but just be aware of it, and then you go back to mindfulness and remind yourself of what your question or issue is, and be patient, and see if you can go a little deeper, a little further into whatever it is you're exploring. See if you can explore deeper and further. Repeat, and then repeat again. So we'll do it 3 times. Don't struggle for an answer. That is the biggest obstacle to insight arising. Let insight come to you. What I said earlier about space, if you create the space and you allow there to be space, then insight can arise within that space. For those of you that bought Patton's book, he has a very good chapter about this in there, about how to work with this contemplation practice. But for right now, I'd like to ask you to put down your pens and notebooks, and let's do a short contemplation practice. This is going to be very short. Normally in a contemplation practice, I would like to have maybe 15 minutes or so. That gives you enough time to, but we're gonna do it in about 7 or 8 minutes, because I want to have a couple of minutes to answer any questions and talk about homework. So So I'm going to ring the bell, and then I'm going to do this guided, and you can think of anything that you want to. I'm not going to give you any particular guidelines, so you can think of anything you want to contemplate. So let's start with just simply settling in your seat and bringing your attention to your breath. I'd like to invite you to bring to mind some question or issue that you have some uncertainty about, something that you would like to have more insight with regard to. And just bring it to mind. Articulate it as clearly as you can in your mind. If there is a person or a location, something visual that is associated with it, see if you can bring that into your mind. And now ask yourself, what would it be helpful for me to understand or know about this? Without struggling for an answer, just let that hang there, keeping in mind whatever your question or issue is. What would it be helpful for me to know about this? And when you have something come to mind, if something comes to mind, just set it aside and allow a little space. Maybe bring your attention back to your breath and ask yourself, is there something more? Is there something a little deeper about this situation or person or question? Is there something a little more that it would be helpful for me to know? If nothing arises in response, that's fine too. This is a kind of crash course, so when you have time to allow more space, you might want to revisit this. But if you did have another thought come, you might set that aside as well. And go a little bit deeper, see if there's anything more around this situation that you want to explore that would be helpful for you to know. When you feel like you have explored your question or issue as much as feels right, you can just return to simply being present. Mindfulness practice. So I think we have time if one or two people, maybe if anybody wants to share. Does anybody care to share? You don't have to, certainly. But if anybody had an interesting experience with that and would like to share. Okay, any questions? A question, okay. Questions, comments, or observations, that's what I'd like to say.
So I'm hoping that my answer was just, or my question was just too difficult because nothing came to me. So I'm wondering if I should start smaller. Like, is that, or like, what do you suggest?
Well, my question to you would be, is it like a big situation that you're having a lot of trouble with?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, then I would say especially when you're getting the hang of doing this kind of contemplation, it's helpful to start with something small, like maybe there's one person or one particular element of it that you could work with. And you could ask yourself, for example, if it's a situation of conflict, you might ask, is there something that would be helpful to me to understand in relating to so-and-so? Or why is Joe Blow such a schmuck?
That would help.
Yeah, because actually if you ask yourself that and then you wait, you may have some insight into why Joe Blow is a schmuck that you never would have had as long as you just kept thinking, you know, I can't stand this person, he's blah, 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 blah. Get it? Good. Anybody else? Paige.
I don't think I had an insight because I've asked this question so many times and I haven't gotten the answer yet. But the bodily sensation thing, all of a sudden, like my jaw started to unwind. Like click, 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 like a rubber band unwinding, and I had this clenching thing going on. So thank you.
Well, you're certainly welcome. And in terms of, I didn't do anything. In terms of the contemplation practice, though, if you notice something like that, sometimes we start out with an idea. I would like to, think of this question or this issue or this problem. But sometimes something comes to us. So if something like that happens to you and you notice that, you might become inquisitive about that. And what was I holding there? What? And allow the space for something to arise there. Sometimes our bodies will talk to us about what we need to know, and our minds are thinking, this is what I need to know, but our body's telling us something else. Good. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? So I invite you to, this is normally, if we had more time, we would be spending a lot more time doing the basic mindfulness practice, and then we would introduce contemplation practice. But because of the way we're doing this, I want to give you a lot of tools that you can use as they seem appropriate to you. And so I invite you, and we can have time for discussion next week, to play with this a little bit. The other thing I'd like to invite you to try is a kind of meditation in action that involves just stopping and noticing what you're doing. And we all do, so we tend to think of meditation as this thing that we're setting aside 10 minutes a day to do, and that is good. And if you want to establish a practice, you do need to do that. However, as I said, the point of doing meditation practice is not to become good meditators, or maybe I didn't say this, but I am saying it. It's not to become good meditators. It's so that we can be awake and present in every moment of our lives. So I would like to invite you to pick a couple of activities in your daily life that you could use as cues, as triggers, as prompts to just be present. One of my favorite ones is when I'm brushing my teeth, and I've got one of those toothbrushes that does a little pulse every 30 seconds, so you're supposed, and it's very interesting to me to notice my state of mind, because some mornings I'm just too busy to wait for that 30 seconds to go by, and that tells me something about myself. And then some mornings I'm just like, oh yeah. So that's one thing. Another thing for me is I make a pot of tea every morning. And when I put the tea leaves in the little thing and I pour the boiling water. And it's a good practice of mindfulness for a number of reasons, not least of which is I don't overflow the teapot and get tea leaves all over everything. You can use driving in your car. Often, if I'm taking a long trip, I'll turn on the radio or a podcast or music. But if I'm just driving from my house to St. Johnsbury, a lot of times I will just leave it quiet and pay attention to the act of driving and to what I see around me. So those are my things. You find your things, whatever they may be. If you work somewhere and you every afternoon go to the water cooler or the coffee machine, make your walk a time when you just try to pay attention to what it feels like to simply walk there without planning what the email you're going to write when you get back to your desk. So pick 2 or 3 things in your everyday experience, things that you do every day, and try to remember to do them just being present. Try to remember to see if you can just drop into wakeful presence while you do those things. Does that make sense? Any questions? Okay, good. Well, thank you all so much for being here. I really appreciate your generosity in sharing your experience, and I look forward to working with you next week.